I'm thinking when the founders were creating this new nation, there's something they never imagined could happen. In a few moments, I'm going to tell you what that is. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Payne, and this is a pilot episode of Inside My Mind, a podcast where I connect yesterday's values with today's headlines. I'm actually in a studio on July 4th cutting this pilot episode. It's ironic that this all came together on the day that we celebrate America 250. To conservatives, I guess it's 250 years of freedom. To socialists, I suppose it's 250 years of oligarchy and oppression. Let me ask you a question. Did you ever think you'd live long enough to watch the Supreme Court debate whether a biological man should compete in women's sports? Or did you ever think that you would see them debate on whether someone could fly into America? They could have a baby, and then a week later they could go back to their home country and raise that child, and then someday that child could become president of the United States, even though they were influenced in a culture that was incredibly counter to ours. I'm going to tell you, if that makes perfect sense to you, then I would ask that you please flush your voter ID card down the toilet, okay? The fact that 9 of the brightest legal minds in America, or well, maybe 7 of the brightest, the fact that they had to spend a day discussing silly questions tells me that we have officially reached a point where common sense has been placed on the endangered species list. I can't imagine what the founding fathers would be thinking if they sat in on a session of the Supreme Court today. Now, in a future episode, I'm going to explore the question of whether or not America is a Christian nation. I know there's a lot of divided thinking on that, and that's going to be actually a whole episode of its own. But just in thinking with me for a minute, consider this with me. Do you think that many of the key leaders that formed our nation had a strong faith heritage, and that would have most likely influenced their reasoning? It seems the original language has the language of faith, or the original documents had the language of faith written all over them. All right, we just took a quick stop at a rest area. Now let's get back to topic, okay? The question, I guess, is how did we get here today? And could it be that the foundations of our nation are beginning to erode? And if they are, why is that? You see, the Constitution isn't just another government document, is it? It's actually like an owner's manual for America. And I started wondering myself how Americans today view our founding documents, and if they believe that they're still relevant to govern in our society. And I wondered if anyone else had looked into that, and it actually turns out that a lot of people have. There have been dozens of polls and scopes of research on that very thing. The results to me are actually quite disheartening, and I think reveal why we're seeing such dysfunction in our society today. Now, keep in mind that the last amendment, which was the 27th Amendment, was submitted for ratification in 1789, and it died due to a lack of state support. But it was resurrected actually in the early 1980s, and it became law in 1992. Now, that's a long time to change anything, and it may give us a little bit of insight into how difficult it would be for us to change any of our additional founding documents. But here's where it gets interesting to me. According to the work that's been done, Americans fall into 4 categories in relation to their view of our founding documents. Research and polling that I have looked at reveals that 41% of American citizens still believe that we should guard the original intent of the Constitution. So, in other words, about 41% of American citizens believe that when the Constitution was written, it was written with moral principles and moral foundations. And those should not change, they believe, to any large extent. Our society today, it's believed by this 41%, still should be honoring of those and should still function actually in that same capacity. So that's 41%. Now, here's where the wheels kind of leave the buggy. Okay, the second group represents 39% of American citizens today. They have an adversarial view toward the original intent of the Constitution. So, in other words, 39% of the American people feel like the Constitution might have worked well when it was written, but it just isn't completely relevant for our society today, and it needs to be changed. They don't believe something written in 1776 can be applied correctly in 2026, so we need to basically rework a lot of things, or at least they want some things to better reflect our current structure. That's 39%. Most of them are not thinking everything needs to be changed, just those things that doesn't fit their lifestyle or doesn't fit their particular bias. Now, there's a third group, and that group makes up 9% of Americans. And the research shows that this 9% hate this nation, and they hate everything about it. They feel it's an awful country, that it was built on the backs of victims, and they literally despise the nation. And the thing is many of them hold an elected office. And incidentally, many of them were also strong supporters of Obama's presidency when he stated that he was going to radically transform our nation, which he really widely accomplished. Now, let's take a hard look at the fourth or the last group, because they are simply a disgrace to any nation. These are the kind of people that when you hear someone ask the question, how stupid can you be? They just assume it's a challenge. And sadly, this final group makes up 11% of American citizens. They're people who are almost completely disengaged about everything regarding culture and society. They just plug along and they do whatever they're told. They're too lazy to learn. They're too lazy to engage in anything, and they're just floating along in society like someone in a pool noodle floating down a lazy river. Whatever way the current or the tide takes them, that's the way they go. They don't resist it. They don't investigate it. They just flow with it. They're the ones that actually think that you can lease a car for $79 a month, or that you actually can get a free iPhone from a mobile carrier. They live and they walk among us. Now, if you stop and think about it, as a culture and a society, if only 41% of the people in America believe that the nation should be a moral nation and believe in moral absolutes and believe in protecting original intent, where does that leave us? It leaves us where we are today. We're in a society that is incredibly broken in almost every way. You know, if you think about it, how can we make America great again if a collective 59% of Americans don't think it was ever completely great to begin with? It's no wonder our culture is such a mess. It's no wonder we're dealing with the things that we're dealing with today. And here's a really scary part. That collective 59% have captured our media. They have captured our education system. They've captured sports and entertainment industry. They've captured our government, and they're beginning to capture even many of our faith institutions. The thing is, they're capturing every facet of American culture. And as a result of that, we're going to continue to slide in that direction with no hope of change. American men and women died defending our world from the evils of greed and an unbridled hunger for power that only sees 59% of Americans voting for the very systems that we defeated with our own blood. Socialism and communism are now beginning to capture our culture, and we're become a nation where 59% of Americans are actually voting for systems that the rest of the world are trying to escape. Now, we're going to pause for just a brief moment, and I'll be right back after this important announcement. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you to consider supporting the Tunnel to Towers Foundation. I want to be clear that I'm not affiliated with them in any official way, and nothing I say on this podcast should be interpreted as representing the organization or its views. I'm simply a grateful American who believes we should never forget the brave men and women who have sacrificed so much to protect our freedoms. The Tunnel to Towers Foundation honors the memory of our fallen military heroes and first responders by caring for the families they leave behind and providing life-changing support to those who have sacrificed for all of us. A grateful nation remembers, a grateful people give. If you'd like to stand with them, please visit t2t.org. That's t2t.org. Welcome back to Inside My Mind. Now, let's look at our society today as compared to the days of our founding fathers, and let's look at one more major reason that I think we're seeing a growing decline in our nation. I think the Constitution is an incredible piece of work, but as we try to apply it to our society and our culture today, it has one huge unintended weakness, and there's one prevailing reason why that is. When the framers of our country formed these documents, they were not able to comprehend how evil a society could become. Their worldview at that time was pretty narrow, and they had very limited data. Now, they had witnessed evil in many forms, but they didn't have any idea just what evil really look like. In our culture today, we have reinvented evil. The founders only knew what they had seen, and they had not seen anything compared to what we see today. Nothing even remotely compared to the rot and the decay of today. Our founders never imagined that children would identify as cats and that schools would put litter pans in the restrooms. They never imagined that they would see murderers hailed as cultural heroes. They never imagined the government telling citizens that if your musket has a thumb hole on the stock, it's an assault weapon and you can't even own it. They never imagined parties that would be themed around burning the flag. They never imagined protests turning into riots where businesses were burned and looted just because they were on Main Street. They never imagined politicians involved in insider trading without any retribution while prosecuting citizens for the same thing. They never imagined education ensuring that kids had no concept of history, so they'd grow up to be adults that had no idea of structure of their government. This would all have been beyond the thinking of even the brightest minds. In October of 1798, John Adams, one of the founders, wrote this to the Massachusetts militia. He said, "Because we have no government that is armed with power capable of contending with human passions that are unbridled by morality and religion, then avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry could break the strongest cords of our Constitution just as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, he said. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. I grew up in West Virginia, and when I was growing up, my family attended church. In fact, there were not even sporting events taking place on Sundays. I realized not everyone was a person of faith, but I saw a big dividing line between law-abiding and lawlessness. When I was a kid, we didn't have sports bars. We had beer joints. We didn't have people who drank too much. We had drunks. We didn't have people who occasionally made some poor choices. We had criminals. We didn't have people who would break into properties and take things. We had thieves. In school, we were trained in civics and American history and democracy. And the primary difference between Republicans and Democrats was actually their view on how much involvement the government should have in the lives of people. Democrats lean more toward social and government programs as helping, and Republicans leaned more toward individualism. But all of them largely loved America. They could serve together. They could associate as friends with one another. They could worship together, and they could debate ideas, and they could even come to some common consensus on many things. Now, I grew up in a Republican family. I'm no longer a registered Republican. I'm actually registered as a conservative now because I don't have a massive level of faith in the Republican Party as it is now, and I have zero faith in the Democrat Party. But I grew up in a family who was pretty active, pretty steeped almost in politics. But some of our closest friends were Democrats. And we really didn't pay much attention to party affiliation, but rather we valued in one another character and integrity. And quite honestly, I saw those qualities in people in both parties, even people elected to office. There seemed to be a strong sense of value. And when those were lacking, there was suspicion across the board. We didn't call truth your truth. We simply called it the truth. If you committed a crime, there weren't usually riots supporting the criminals, but rather there was a desire to see the punishment fit the crime. If anyone would have dared to loot somebody else's property, there would have been swift retribution regardless of party lines. The kind of behavior of that type was unacceptable in a civil society. If kids were displaying poor behavior in those days, we didn't have timeouts. It would more be like lights out. I remember one time in elementary school getting caught shooting paper wads with rubber bands in my class, and that led to a journey to the principal's office. And there was a well-shaped wooden paddle that had some intense fellowship with my posterior. If you think my day got better when I got home, you didn't grow up where I did. But those years had a profound impact on my worldview. Today, in a healthy way, those years shaped how I still look at the world. I still believe words mean things. Right is still right. Wrong is still wrong. Character matters. Integrity matters. Personal responsibility matters. And maybe that makes me old-fashioned, and if it does, I'm okay with that. I'm willing to be a dinosaur. I view the world through a lens of morality and respect, and it makes me sad that those values are no longer at the core of our society. I miss that. I really do. In fact, I mourn that loss as if it were some personal loss. That's the kind of society our founders understood. Not necessarily because everyone agreed, but not because everyone went to church, and Not because everyone was perfect, but because there was still a broad agreement that character mattered. That's a kind of society John Adams assumed would continue. When you observe our laws and societal standards, they are intentionally designed to govern people who still have a foundation of morality and conviction. People who believe there is still right and wrong, who believe there is still good and evil, black and white. But here's the thing, we're not there anymore. It was about 200 years ago, there was a French philosopher, his name was Alexis de Tocqueville, and he spent about 10 months visiting America because he wanted to kind of uncover the secrets of what made America great. And he said these words, he said, "Not until I went into the churches of America and heard their pulpits aflame with righteousness did I understand the secret of her genius and power. America is great because she is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." But now we interpret everything about the Constitution through the lens of modern culture and morality. If our founders saw this derangement, they'd be like a dog staring at a new dish. I don't think George Washington imagined we'd eventually need 900-page court opinion explaining what a woman is. And I'll be dealing with that in an upcoming episode. Now let's look at one more bit of evidence regarding the Supreme Court and why we may be where we are to some point in our culture today. Let's revisit the gender in sports decision that the Supreme Court just acted on. Is it possible that this whole train wreck started decades ago and is now really just coming home to roost? We don't like to say this, but we may in some ways be reaping what we've sown. You see, I think this mess actually started when we began to allow girls to compete in men's sports. When I was in school, there were sports for both genders. And I don't know why that was such a bad thing. Communities and schools had programs for boys, they had programs for girls. But I can remember when girls started trying out for Little League Baseball, which was always a boys' sport. It seemed weird to me at the time, but it caught on, even though there were already leagues for girls. Maybe there weren't leagues on the scale that there were for boys, but if you really think about it, whose fault is that? The moment that we started removing the designation of mixing genders in sports, we opened up the particular can of worms, and now we can't get them back in the can. But what we have done today is we're now taking it a step further. Now it isn't boys just deciding it's easier to play girls' sports so they can get the better scholarships and break all the records. Now we have boys actually believing that they are girls. And this kind of nonsense goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. The founders wrote a document thinking that this document would govern the country for decades, and they made provisions that if it needed, it could be amended. But they never, I don't believe, thought that it was too hard to understand and that it would need constant reinterpretation. But, of course, they were looking through that lens of a moral perspective, and they couldn't conceive it could cause this much confusion. If they could, they would have probably built more safeguards in to prevent it from being hijacked by insanity. Do you think somewhere George Washington is choking on his wooden teeth? And here's where it gets even more interesting. There's a growing delusion that Americans actually think we can rely on elected officials to turn things around. That would be a lot like hoping to plant an apple tree and harvest tomatoes. Elected officials can't solve our problems. They are our problems. They created many of them, and they have no desire to solve them. And to me, holding a delusion that Republicans and Democrats are going to work together and make things better is just about as certain as House of Representatives Rosa DeLauro getting a modeling contract with Victoria's Secrets. You see, we're now deadlocked in Congress. Republicans hold 218 seats. Democrats hold 212 seats. So nothing good is going to happen there because a lot of the Republicans are just as moderate and liberal as the Democrats. And what about the Senate? The current split in the U.S. Senate is 53 Republicans to 47 Democrats, and there are 2 independents who always vote with Democrats. So basically it's 53 to 49. So it ain't going to happen there either. So going back to that national survey of the 4 groups, with a 59% to 41% majority against the Constitution, how are we going to see good win over evil? I want you to imagine for a minute that you bought a brand new Mercedes and somehow you decided, I think I can improve this. So you take it apart, you put it back together again, but you install a Ford transmission in it, and you install a GM engine, and you put Toyota doors and fenders on it, and you put Nissan electronics in time, and the finishing touch, you put the dashboard from a riding lawnmower. Congratulations. You just reinvented modern constitutional interpretation. You see, the Constitution didn't suddenly stop working. The Constitution didn't suddenly fail. Character failed. You can rewrite laws. You can elect new politicians. You can appoint new judges. But if character disappears, none of those things can save a nation. That's the conversation that nobody wants to have, which is exactly why we need to have it. So until the next time, keep thinking, because apparently somebody has to.